So the topic for today is functional safety assessment. I'm going to start directly in the standard where we talk about functional safety assessment, and let me make this a little bit bigger so it's legible to human eyes, and back up as far as I need to. Yeah, functional safety assessment. So functional safety assessment is a critical part of the IEC 61511 standard, and it is in clause 5. And when you think about clause 5 is management systems. So human activities, policies, procedures, and it is really clause 5 that gets into reducing human error. One of the upcoming webinars that I need to get on the calendar is going to talk about why it's a really bad idea to try to account for human failure when you're doing your SIL verification calculations. Long story short, it's not only not beneficial, it's going to cause you to have worse designs. So if you don't meet your SIL target because your human failure rate is too high, what do? You increase the test interval and you increase the amount of redundancy that you have. Well, human failure is essentially 100% common cause. So testing more frequently gives you more opportunities to make mistakes. And if you didn't calibrate the first transmitter in a 2 out of 3 vote correctly, you're surely not going to calibrate 2 and 3 correctly. So we don't address human failure by pencil whipping some math while we're doing our SIL verification. We address human failures in clause 5. We address them through management system techniques, beginning with creating a functional safety plan. So what are all the activities that need to occur to implement the safety life cycle? Who is going to do them? Who is going to verify them? When are they going to be done? What policies and procedures and tools are we going to use to implement that? So step 1 is that development of the functional safety plan. If you have not developed the functional safety plan for your organization, you can download one off of the Kenexis website, www.kenexis.com. We've got a free template for you. And a little bit of an announcement. We are working real hard on an online store. So the Kenexis website is going to include an online store through which you will be able to buy all of our software products with a credit card. No fuss, no muss, no hassle. But you'll also be able to get all of our free products from that website also. So keep an eye out for that. It'll be coming up in the next few months. Okay, so once we have a plan, we need to make sure the people are competent to execute the tasks that they've been assigned to do in that plan. Then, while we're executing that functional safety plan, we're going to do verification. So verification actually shows up in clause 7. It is its own clause, and verification's kind of like the step-by-step paperwork back check or testing of a small component of the design. So one person does a SIL verification calc, somebody else verifies that that calc has been done correctly. That's verification. That's another way we reduce human failure. Oh, by the way, I just finished recording the podcast on verification. I just recorded it on Monday. It'll probably be available either next week or the week after. We try to put those podcasts out about once a week. If you're not familiar, I do a functional safety podcast where I basically go through the standard one clause at a time and pontificate on it and elaborate and give you war stories from the standards committee on how it was developed. So might be something that you're into. Okay, so all of that leads us into assessment, auditing, and revisions, and specifically we're going to be focusing on functional safety assessment. But functional safety assessment is so closely linked to what happens in an audit, we're really going to be covering both activities, but I will clarify that the scope of a functional safety assessment is a specific project, whereas when you're doing auditing, you're looking at the entire scope of the facility for a particular instance in time. So the activities between a functional safety assessment and an audit are going to be almost identical to each other. It's just a matter of the scope of what you're looking at. Okay, so functional safety assessment, again, is that mechanism to catch human errors early before they turn into a disaster. So how is a functional safety assessment different than a verification? You're not doing a verification. The verification should have already been done. You can think of a functional safety assessment as an audit on a particular project. So we're not looking for every calculation, redoing the calculation to make sure that it was done correctly. Instead, we're going to look at what does our functional planning say we're supposed to do. Was it done the way that we said we were going to do it? So auditing is kind of a big picture item. It's discussed in a lot of detail in the OSHA Process Safety Management Rule, or whatever legal framework applies to the country you're in is probably going to be very similar, whether it's COMA or SEVASO or what have you. They all have very similar requirements to each other. So in an audit, you're not checking the work. You're basically making sure that you're doing what you said you were going to do. And here, let me draw on my magic screen here. I got my magical pencil here, and I am going to write down 3 letters that come from OSHA, and they are PQV. Always remember PQV when you're doing auditing, when you're doing assessments, when you're doing functional safety assessments. What does PQV mean? What does it stand for? Well, if you look at OSHA guidance, not the actual regulation, but the guidance to OSHA inspectors that are going to come visit your plant, and all of that is publicly available. You could go to the OSHA website and you can get the policies and procedures that the inspectors are going to be using when they come to your plant. So when an audit happens, it needs to contain 3 things. That is program, quality, and verification. That's the PQV. So a standard like IEC 61511 is going to have requirements. So one of the requirements would be, for instance, if we go to clause 11, there's a requirement that says manual shutdowns should be when a shutdown occurs, there should be a manual reset unless the SRS specifies otherwise. That is the requirement. Now, for you as a company, you need to have a program that makes sure that that requirement is implemented consistently. So that program is going to be your functional safety planning, your corporate standard, your template documents. It's encapsulated in a whole lot of different things. So when we're auditing, we're first checking what is your program for fulfilling that requirement. The second item is going to be important in auditing, and I'm going to kind of with dash lines cross it out, because it's not that important for a functional safety assessment. When we say quality in PQV, what we actually mean is, so I have a requirement in the standard, my company needs to have a program for fulfilling that requirement. The quality is, well, how good is your company's program? Now, on a project by project basis, we're more interested in verifying that you followed your program as opposed to looking at what your program is and saying, well, that is a good way or not a good way to meet that requirement. So, for instance, for that clause I just talked about for manual reset, your program might be that you have a template for safety requirement specifications that states that a manual reset will always be implemented. Okay, that's a pretty good quality, that's pretty definitive, but you might have a program that says the PLC logic vendor shall determine what's appropriate. I don't know if that's as good of a quality of a program as definitively saying we are always going to use manual resets unless otherwise specified with justification. So, what is the program for implementing the requirement? What is the quality of that program? And you need to think back, you need to go, how many requirements are there in the standard? Basically, every clause, every numbered clause has at least one requirement. When you see something like this, there's a whole bullet list of requirements that sit on that one bullet point. So it could get very long and elaborate, but you need to know what the program is for every requirement. The last part is the V, or the verification. So I know there's a clause in the standard. I have a program for meeting that requirement, but the last little bit is, are people actually doing what you said you're gonna do? So if your program is all resets need to be manual, and then you implement a project and you see that one of the resets is automatic and there's no justification or documentation of why you're using an automatic reset, you basically identified the fact that you didn't do what you said you were going to do. So most of the work in a functional safety assessment is for each requirement, knowing what that operating company, whether it's yours or if you're a consultant somebody else's, what program is being used to implement this requirement, and then you need to verify that you actually implemented that requirement as the program states. So let me step back a little bit more on this and give you an example. So for instance, your program for selecting SIL targets might be that we are going to implement a layer of protection analysis in accordance with corporate standard XYZ. If you're doing a functional safety assessment and when you're looking at the risk analysis, you see that the project team used a risk graph to pick SIL targets. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong about using risk graph. But from a functional safety assessment, the project did not follow the program. So you have to punch it out and say that your program is X, what you did is Y. These two things are incompatible, so you're going to need to resolve that issue. So a lot of that falls into the verification side, and that's basically the focus. So PQV is going to be true whether you're doing a functional safety audit or a functional safety assessment. When you're doing an assessment, you're narrowly focusing in on one project, and you're not really super worried about the quality of the program. You're just making sure that the project followed the program. Is there a question, Chris? Oh, I thought I heard a question. Okay, so let's kind of bang through the requirements for functional safety assessment in the standard real quick, and then I will show you some examples of how this works in practice, and even kind of go through some of the requirements one bit at a time. Okay, so 52611, a procedure shall be defined and executed for an FSA in such a way that judgment can be made that functional safety and safety integrity is achieved by every SIF in the SIS. Okay, so you need in your functional safety planning to explain when and where all the functional safety assessments are going to be performed and how they're going to be performed. What I'm going to recommend a little bit later is that you use a tool like Kenexis' Open-Audit tool to give you structure and allow you to document that process. So that's a good way to do it. If you download the Kenexis template, it's going to tell you that that's the way that you should be doing your functional safety assessments. Okay, the next clause talks about the team. So basically in FSA, there are two criteria that we're worried about. Senior competent, not involved. Okay, so we want the FSA to be done with a cold eye, hands-off approach. So whoever's doing a functional safety assessment should not have been involved in any way, shape, or form in the project. Now, for some companies with really big sites, the West Plant SIS engineer can audit the work of the East Plant SIS engineer, as an example. Or maybe you might want to get somebody from corporate to come in and review. And also, you know, if you want to go the more expensive route, maybe it's the first time you're doing an FSA, using a third-party consultant like Kenexis is always an option. Although, you know, we kind of would lean you toward, once you learn how to do it, it's not that difficult. You can do it yourself, but maybe the first time you might want to get some help. And then you need to think about what stages you're going to do the functional safety assessment in. The stages, I don't know whether now would be a good time to talk about stages or later. Let me get to the end before I talk about what the stages are. So somebody who's not involved, somebody who's independent, but they need to be senior and competent separately. Competent, somebody who knows safety instrumented systems in general. Qualified, trained, certified. Senior, because when they say something, when they come up with a recommendation, it has to get respect, it has to have weight. So we don't want the new guy doing an assessment and then everybody says yeah, 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 and throws their recommendations in the trash. Okay, senior competent person not involved in the project. You also need to think about when you're going to do these functional safety assessments. Okay, I'm going to come up, all the stages are discussed here, so I will talk about these when we get to clause 52614. So 52613, the following items shall be considered when planning an FSA. So whatever your plan is, it needs to consider what is the scope of what you're doing. When you're doing an FSA, you are doing it on a project, not the operation of the facility as a whole, for that project, that SIS, that modification. You're going to define who's going to participate in the FSA. That's usually something that's in your functional safety planning, your corporate standard. You need to kind of, what are the quals of the people on the FSA team? Why are they competent and senior? The information that's going to be generated, so you need some sort of plan for what the output is going to be. And it just so happens that if you use Open-Audit, it will generate a report for you, which is pretty slick. We need to know the identity of other safety bodies involved in the FSA. This is not something that is usually an issue in the US, but sometimes other people want to be involved. So for instance, if you're using IEC 61511 to design a boiler, you might have your local fire marshal might want to be involved in the functional safety assessment. So it's possible. If that's the case, you need to include him. What resources do we need? Time, money, travel expenses, whatever it takes. The level of independence of the FSA team, and this is something that's not really stressed a whole lot in 1511. It's stressed more in the 61508 standard, that as the higher the SIL number goes, the higher degree of independence you're probably going to want for your project. So if you're trying to implement a SIL 4, you probably want to bring in some independent third-party consultant experts, whereas if all you've got is SIL 1, maybe doing an FSA with your on-site people is going to be just fine. Of course, as we learn in clause 8 and 9, if you determine you need SIL 4, you probably want to start over. But that's a topic for another day. Okay, a little note here: when the FSA team is large, consideration to having more than one senior competent person is a possibility. All right, clause 5261 talks about what the FSA team is doing. So we're reviewing the work carried out in all of the phases of the safety life cycle prior to the stage in which we are doing the FSA. So basically, when you do an FSA, you're picking a point in time and you're reviewing all of the work that happened prior to that. And the standard defines, or the current version of the standard defines stages. For those of you that don't know, I'm in the IEC Group 65, which handles, which reviews, which maintains the 61511 standard. The next version of the 61511 standard, a lot of this terminology is either going to go away or change. Why? I'm still not sure why a lot of people are worried about this, but I digress. It really doesn't matter. We have 5 stages. And so stage 1 is after I've done my HAZOP LOPA, review what was done to make sure it was done correctly. Stage 2 is after your SIS design. So maybe it's after you've done the SIL verification calcs, you're going to want to get those FSA'd, or maybe maybe you're all the way at your FAT, and before you get delivery of your logic solver from the equipment vendor, you might want to have an FSA done. So that would be stage 2. Stage 3 is right before you, in my UOP days, we would say before you put oil in. So before you actually introduce hazards to the process. So everything's already done at this point in time. It's installed, commissioned, validation is done, and we're going to do that one last check. Stage 3, if you only do one functional safety assessment, it should be at stage 3. And if you didn't do a stage 1 and a stage 2, that doesn't mean that those stages don't get reviewed. It just means that you're waiting until stage 3 to review all the activities: HNRA, design, installation, commissioning, validation. You will FSA everything all at the same time instead of one stage at a time. Now, there are a couple more stages that get a little bit wonky. So stage 4, after gaining experience operating and maintenance. My recommendation on a stage 4 FSA is that usually you'll implement an SIS, and then you'll start the plant, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, you're going to have the next turnaround after you implemented the SIS. that's a good time to do a stage 4. Because what we're checking on in stage 4 is making sure that we're following our operating procedures, we're following our maintenance procedures, we're appropriately looking at our failure rate data, comparing it against our assumptions. All of that kind of stuff happens in a stage 4. So stage 4 and stage 3 necessarily will never be done at the same time. Well, should never be done at the same time unless you massively screwed up. So stage 3 should have been before you put oil in, before you introduce hazards to the plant. Stage 4, give me 1 or 2 turnarounds after we implemented the SIS to make sure that we're doing our operation and maintenance correctly. Stage 5, again, a little bit wonky. You'll probably end up doing it at the same time as stage 4. And that's basically saying, okay, for this project that we put into service 2 to 10 years ago, have there been modifications? Has there been a decommissioning? And if so, are we appropriately following our management of change procedures when we make modifications to that process? So when you do your stage 4, there might not have been an MOC related to that equipment, which means, well, we're going to have to wait until the next turnaround to see if we have any MOCs associated with that work. All right. Note 3
Question,
talks
Ed.
about, yes.
Question, what would be the typical composition of the FSA team?
Honestly, almost every FSA that I have been a part of there was a facilitator was the FSA team. So one facilitator was the entire FSA team. But with that being said, you need to, and I'll show you this when we get into Open-Audit, there is one facilitator who's asking the questions, reviewing the evidence. I'll show you what I mean by evidence, and then making recommendations and so on. So for most medium to small sized projects, I would expect only one facilitator, but during the FSA, the evidence collection is going to be interviewing people who were involved in the design. So the team is going to include people that were involved in the project, the people who did the SIL calcs, the people who facilitated the HAZOP-LOPA, the people that were part of the HAZOP-LOPA team, the equipment vendor who did the design, the people who were at the FAT. All of these people are going to, shall we say, give a deposition while that FSA is happening. But generally there's, for again, small to medium project, there's only going to be one person that's kind of facilitating the process. If it's really big, you might have multiple facilitators where one person is FSAing the HAZOP-LOPA and a different person might be FSAing the detailed design aspect. But it's very rare that I've seen more than one facilitator talking to the project team. I think once I get into the software and kind of do a mock FSA process, it'll make a lot more sense what I'm talking about. Okay, so for stage 3 or note 3 to clause 52614 talks about, you need to consider, and it's kind of relevant to that last question, the size and scope of the FSA activities. If your FSA is related to an MOC project where we replaced our Rosemount 3051 with a Yokogawa, that's a really small project. The complexity is small. It doesn't require that much resources. Whereas if you're replacing the logic solver in your hydrocracker complex, That's going to be a bigger project that requires more people, more specialties, more disciplines. So all those things in note 3 kind of factor into your planning of how much time it's going to take, how many people need to be involved. Okay, clause 52615 basically says prior to hazards being present, before you put oil in, the FSA team needs to undertake a functional safety assessment. I'm not going to belabor these bullet points much, but basically you need to make sure that you did your hazard and risk assessment. That hazard and risk assessment has been carried into your SIS design. We've got all our procedures in place related to MOC. If any recommendations have been generated, they need to be resolved before you start your plant. You need to make sure that the SIS was designed, constructed, and installed in accordance to the SRS. Well, really what you're checking is to make sure that the validation was done, because that's the job of the validation. Making sure all of those procedures that you're going to need during the operation phase are in place. Validation planning was done and the validation activities are complete. Recommendations resolved. Training has been done to make sure that the people that are going to operate the plant know how to do it. And then a little bit of planning for those stage 4 and stage 5 functional safety assessments. Okay, I'm going to go into a lot more detail here in just a second when we get into one of these FSA worksheets. All right, so let me blast through some of these remaining recommendations. 616 says where design, development, production tools are used for any life cycle activities, they themselves shall be subject to functional safety assessment and verification. So make sure that any software that you're using has gone through validation. So we at Kenexis, for instance, all of our software tools like Vertigo that you would use for SIS design, we can show you, if you come here and sign an NDA, we can show you all of our validation testing. We got a big book that says, you know, this is what's supposed to happen, this is what actually happened. So it's not just your project. The tools that you use to implement your project need to be validated and FSA'd. We need any of the results shall be available. Having them sit on the Kenexis Integrated Safety Suite is a great way to do that. They're available to the entire organization, read only if that's what's necessary. All information shall be made to the entire FSA team. In cases where the FSA is carried out on a modification, we need to confirm that all the modification work is done. So even if your project is an MOC project, you still have to do FSA. That's part of it. Item 10, the final one, says the FSA shall be carried out periodically during the operations and maintenance phase to ensure that that maintenance and operation are being carried out in accordance to the assumptions made during design, blah, blah, blah. I have a little bit of heartburn with this last clause, because if you do FSAs periodically during the operation of the plant, then how is an FSA different from a functional safety audit? How is a functional safety assessment different from a functional safety audit? And I've already told you that the answer is that an FSA is an audit on the work you did for a specific project, whereas the functional safety audit is more of a mechanism for compliance with that OSHA PSM rule that says you need to audit every 3 years in the US all of your process safety management programs, and functional safety is a subset, a small subset, one of those programs that fall under that once every 3 year audit regime. Okay, so those are the requirements for how you do your functional safety assessment. How are we going to do this? All right, well, let me back up and bear with me for a second. General Oil and Gas Operating Company. Let me make this screen a little bit bigger once again, because we like for human beings to actually be able to see the screen. Yeah, 150% is probably good enough. Okay, a lot of you are familiar with the Kenexis Integrated Safety Suite, a one-stop shop for doing all of your technical safety tasks, whether it's HAZOP LOPA, whether it's SIL verification, SIS lifecycle management, whether it's fault tree analysis, fire and gas mapping, bow ties, everything is in here. And one of the modules in the Kenexis Integrated Safety Suite is the Open-Audit. So if I go here, I click Insert, I can go into Open-Audit, and I can create a blank audit file, which is what I did right here. And let me put in something here so I don't lose it. So demo audit. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I already have a template. Okay, so if you look at Open-Audit, it's going to look very similar to Open-PHA. Obviously, we reused a lot of the same code because the code is really good. So you've got study demo information that talks about what is the study, who's involved in the assessment, what sessions, what meetings did we have, who attended, what documents did we look at, and so on. And then you're going to get into categories of questions, and then we're going to have a worksheet where we answer those questions. We're going to have a worksheet where we provide evidence, and then our ability to provide recommendations, and even to score things and put weighting factors so that we not only say, pass, fail, did we pass our functional safety assessment, we could give it a score of, okay, you guys got 90, average is 80, so your FSA is, your project is better than average is something that we can do. So Open-Audit out of the gate, you can do an audit on anything you want, whether that's process safety management, whether that's auditing your taxes, auditing your financial records, auditing, you name it. It's all possible in Open-Audit. But Open-Audit, what I just showed you there, is a blank slate. So what we also have available, now you don't have available to you, but I will make it available. It's going to be available in a very short time frame. So if I go to Kenexis templates, and also I should note right here that similar to Open-PHA, our desktop version of Open-Audit is free. Go to our website, click on the download button, you get the desktop software free of charge. But it's going to be a blank slate. If you want this audit template, send me an email, send Chris an email, and we will email it to you in the short term. In the longer term, it's something that when you create a new file, you're going to be able to select a template to start from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy out of the Kenexis library files, and then I'm going to go back into General Oil and Gas Operating Company, and I am going to paste that template into here. And now this is what an SIS audit is going to look like. So for every audit that you do, you're going to be filling out this overview information yourself. You're going to be putting the team members in yourself. You're going to be putting in the sessions and all this stuff. But the categories, or kind of the meat of it, is something that is part of your FSA planning. So you remember that first clause that we looked at said that you need to plan how you're going to do your FSA. And that falls into categories and questions. Okay, so in terms of categories, what you're looking at here is roughly going to line up with stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and stage 5, items 1 through 5 here. So 1 is going to be kind of the hazard and risk assessment. Stage 2 is going to be your SIL verification, programming. Stage 3 is going to be PSAT, SAT, commissioning, validation, operation, maintenance, and so on. You'll also see that this template contains a Section 6. Section 6 is something that you would generally only do while you're auditing and not while you're doing a functional safety assessment. And when I show this to you, the Category 6 is more about questions of program quality. So we're saying, what is your program for doing this? What is the quality of your program? As opposed to, what did you do on this particular project? So if you're doing a FSA for one of your projects, just go ahead and feel free to throw that one out. All right, so we've got our template, and we're going to go into our assessor worksheet. So if you kind of visualize what's happening, I'm going to start by doing the functional safety assessment of the stage 1 activities. And I'm going to do that simply by asking questions. So from a project planning perspective, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I need to talk about hazard and risk analysis. Who was involved in the hazard and risk analysis? I'm going to get the HAZOP-LOPA facilitator. Maybe I'm going to get the SIS engineer who was sitting in the meeting. Maybe I'm going to get one of the operators that was sitting in the meeting. It's kind of flexible. It's kind of up to you. At a minimum, you're going to want to talk to the HAZOP-LOPA facilitator. So you're going to invite that person to a meeting. You're going to sit down either in a conference room, or I do a lot of these over Teams meetings, and we're going to talk. So when I do that, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to set up a session for what time, date, and location did I talk to that person. And I'm going to put that person on my list of team members. Very similar to if I was doing the LOPA. Then once we've got all the formalities in place, we start asking questions. So when you look here, so hazard and risk analysis, that's stage 1. There are going to be questions. So the question that is asked in our worksheet is, has a process hazards analysis been completed for the equipment under control of the SIS? So it's a simple question. Now, this question, where did it come from? All of these questions that you're going to ask are going to be tied to a reference document. So when you're doing an audit, when you're doing an assessment, you're not using your gut feel to say, is this good or not? There is a document that contains requirements, and you're checking to make sure those requirements are fulfilled. So this question, its intention is to verify that this requirement was fulfilled. So if I go back to the 1511 standard, and I'm going to go to clause 8.2.1, eventually, 8.2.1 says, H&RA shall be carried out on the materials, process, and equipment. So yes or no, did you do that? Furthermore, to make your life a little bit easier, in addition to having the question, I also have assessor guidance. So this is if you're not the most experienced auditor, it gives you some tips and tricks for what you're supposed to be doing. So number 1, when you're asking this question, you should be making sure that there's a program in place for completing an SIS. So it's not just a yes or no question. It's like, okay, well, how did you do it? Do you have a corporate standard that you're following when you did this? Okay, so you're going to want to know what the program was, and then you're also going to want to verify PQV, making the Q very quiet. So what is the program? And then verify that it actually happened. So coming out of this question, you should say to the person that you're in the meeting with, show me your program. So they should hand you a LOPA procedure. And then you're like, okay, thank you, that's the program. Now show me your evidence that you actually did the study. And that's where they would hand you your the report of the LOPA for that project. So now there are three things that just happened right there that we're going to document over here. So evidence. How do I know they did what they said they were going to do? Well, evidence item number 1 was interview with Brutus Buckeye, who is our the HAZOP facilitator. So that's one piece of evidence. Then I'm going to add another piece of evidence that says go company LOPA procedure. That's another piece of evidence. Then I'm going to add in gas plant LOPA, come on Ed, LOPA report. That's another piece of evidence. And the way that OpenPHA works, you're creating a relational database of all the items of evidence. So we started with a blank one in there. I'm going to go ahead and delete that item out so that everything numbers properly. So I'm going to have evidence, and then you put your notes in here that says the project followed the procedure, the project assessed the entire scope of activities in accordance with the program. Okay, obviously you do more than that, because in the meeting you're going to get this information, but after the meeting you, the auditor, are going to read through and make sure, regardless of what your interviewee told you, you're going to say, okay, yes, they did follow the LOPA procedure. Yes, this report matches up with the procedure. Yes, this report is comprehensive and it's of a good quality. So once you've gone through all this effort, you're going to give them a score. Now, in our template, we have compliant, partially compliant, non-compliant. But you can modify those to use whatever names you want to give them, whatever scoring details you want to give them, whatever weighting factors you want to assign. As a matter of fact, in this template, we didn't even incorporate the concept of weighting factors so that you could do a scoring of that process. So here we'll say, yes, this is compliant. And if you're compliant, you shouldn't have any findings, and you shouldn't have any recommendations. Okay, and then we kind of repeat this process over and over and over for every bullet point that you run into while you're doing your work. So does the PHA identify the hazards? So in this case, review the PHAs, review the P&IDs to make sure the SIFs correlate with what's on the P&IDs. Make sure that every SIF on the P&IDs has been discussed in the hazard and risk analysis. So what is our evidence here? Well, our evidence is basically going to be exactly the same. So we're going to have our interview. We're going to have our company procedure. And actually, our company procedure is not evidence for this one. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that item. Let's see here, the last item was the LOPA report itself. So those are the items of evidence for here. Now, I might make some notes here that say the LOPA generally follows the procedure for LOPA. Review of the P&IDs shows that there are several apparent SIF that are not included in the HAZOP or LOPA and thus have not had their SIL targets. Come on, learn to spell, man. Defined. Okay, so that's kind of the assessor note. So picture the situation where you're doing you're doing a functional safety assessment on a safety instrumented system that includes a fired heater. And the HAZOP says, okay, if the fuel gas pressure goes low, then the shutdown system is going to activate, and that's going to result in a financial consequence while the plant is shut down. And because the consequence is so low, the LOPA procedure was never triggered, so that low fuel gas pressure shutdown never went through LOPA. The HAZOP kind of didn't really analyze what the hazard was properly. And if you're at the FSA stage and you catch that, this is a problem. So the PHA did not identify the hazards that are protected against by the SIS. So we're going to say non-compliant here. And we're going to do findings and recommendations anywhere where we're non-compliant or partially compliant. So a finding here would be view of the P&IDs showed that there are apparent SIF where no evidence of review of the hazard protected by the SIF was analyzed. Okay, hear me now, this is very important. On your findings, don't ever be definitive, don't be accusative, because you don't know. So maybe somewhere there's another piece of documentation somewhere else where this work was done. So you don't say, hey, these people are bad, they didn't do this. Instead of saying they didn't do this, what you say is, I didn't see any evidence of this being done. So don't create enemies. Use your words carefully, and when you're doing your findings, you don't say definitively, they are wrong, they didn't do it. All you say is, I didn't see any evidence of this being done. Okay? So then the recommendation would be perform an additional LOPA study session to address the hazards of the low fuel gas pressure shutdown. Obviously, this is not a good recommendation. I think we have an entire training class on how to write recommendations. So a recommendation needs to be able to stand by itself. So what piece of equipment, what process are we talking about? A little bit about what the finding was that generated the recommendation and what actions need to actually occur to clear that recommendation out. And again, the way that these recommendations work, if you look under the hood at anything in the Open series, whether it's Open-Audit, Open PHA, recommendations are their own table and you can reuse them. So if the next bullet point down has the same recommendation, you can put that same exact recommendation in. It's still item number 2. If we go to the recommendations page, let me get rid of this blank item. You'll see, if I go back to recommendations, you'll see what the recommendation is, and you can do a lot of work with those recommendations. So what's the priority? What's the status? Are there any comments? And then you can go back to every location where that recommendation showed up. So, okay, it showed up in 1.1.2. I click there, and now it's going to go back to the question that generated that recommendation. Chris, I see that somebody's got a question.
Yeah. Do you typically record the interviews to be able to reference them when you are compiling report and then delete the recording later?
Excellent question. The short answer is right now, no. That's not something that we're doing, and the reason is for legal purposes. The official record of a PHA or of an audit is the report. And if people are being recorded, they tend to clam up, not give you their full opinion. They don't want to rat people out if they're going to be on the record ratting people out. So the effect of the chilling effect of knowing you're being recorded kind of decreases the quality. Now, maybe in the future, people are going to get more used to being recorded. So Teams meetings a lot of times are automatically recorded and automatically transcribed. And let me tell you, there are a lot of times where I wish I had a transcript because we got to the end of the day and my file didn't save. So I had to try to recreate that night's discussions in the hotel room from memory. Boy, that is unpleasant. But, you know, if everyone has the knowledge that the transcript, the recording will be destroyed within 1 day or 1 week after the sessions, I think people might get a little bit more accustomed to it. And also, you know, as you know, as a lot of people know, Kenexis is incorporating a lot of artificial intelligence tools into our software suite, and the ability to do automatic transcription of a lot of these discussions is going to make these meetings go faster. So kind of trading off knowing that you've been recorded for a couple days versus I'm going to cut the amount of time I need to sit in this meeting by 80%. That's a trade-off, but we don't know yet. Today, it's not happening. Tomorrow, I believe it will.
Okay, another question. Is color coding an option for the scoring criteria to make it more visual so you have an idea of the status when you're browsing through the document?
You know what? That is not something that we have currently done, but it wouldn't be that hard. I mean, we have color coding in our risk tolerance criteria in Open-PHA. Chris, make a note, send that software feature request to the development team. We could probably bang it out pretty quickly. But no, it's not available today. That's a great idea. We will put it into the pipeline.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions at the moment.
All right, very good. Well, let me kind of move on a little bit because at this point in time, I have hit all of the major concepts. So basically what we're doing is we're taking clauses out of the standard and even drilling down into detail. So if you look at this item right here, clause 8.2.1, bullet point number 7. That's the level of detail that we're going into. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Identification of those safety instrumented functions applied as SIFs. So here, what question are we asking? Does the PHA identify hazards that impact functional safety that will undergo additional consideration during LOPA and sill selection. So you'll see that there's a lot of tracing back and forth. What does the standard say we need to do? And then how do I ask a question to make sure that we actually did that? Okay, so everything here in 1.1 is going to be hazard and risk analysis. And when we're looking at that, you'll see that all of these things tie back to clause number 8. Whereas 1.2 ties back more to clause 9. So if 1.1 is the HAZOP, 1.2 is the LOPA, and if you do your HAZOP and your LOPA together, you'll do both of these things at the same time. Here, we're seeing if we meet the requirements of clause 9, and asking a lot of questions. The safety requirements specification, we have all of those requirements, and these are bullet point locked down. You'll see that there are a whole lot of them here, and that's in the kind of hazard and risk analysis phase of design. As we move on, we're going to go to the different clauses. So SIS design engineering is going to be clause 11 and 12 for software. So does the SIS conform to the SRS, and so on. Once again, it's just pounding home more of the same. What does the clause say you're supposed to do? Ask a question to make sure that you did it. So this goes back to one of the first things that we talked about when we were still looking at the standard. So clause 11.2.7 is the clause that talks about manual resets. So the question we ask is the SIS designed so that once it's put into a safe state, it stays in a safe state? We're verifying that we actually have manual resets. And then, we do our interviews, we do our assessor notes, but now instead of looking at the HAZOP report, depending on what stage we're at, maybe we're going to look at the software program, maybe we're going to look at validation testing, maybe we're actually going to do a software test to make sure that this happened. There's a lot of options for what evidence you're going to use to make sure that all of this is correct. And again, your interviews with people. So in this case, for part 1, we were interviewing the HAZOP LOPA team. For part 2, we're interviewing the SIS engineer, maybe people at site, maybe people at a systems integrator, maybe people at a detailed design contractor. But you don't just rely on their word, you get paperwork to prove that they did what they did, and maybe you're actually going to do a visual inspection, go out into the field and watch a test be performed. So that's SIS design and engineering. There's FAT is also here. We put FAT into design. Some people might want to put it into phase 3. So phase 3 is where you're going to be talking about installation, commissioning. So how do you do your installation and commissioning? How did you do your SAT, your validation? Again, what is the clause requirement? Ask a question about that. Collect your evidence. Do your notes on your assessment. Pick your scoring criteria. Write a recommendation if you need to. So I'm not going to keep belaboring this. We have a section on operation and maintenance, a section on SIS modification, and then this last worksheet is safety life cycle activities. So what you're seeing in here is stuff that generally doesn't happen on a project specifically. It's more appropriate for an audit instead of a specific project. So if you see clause 611 points you back to 5211, when 5211 basically says, do you have a functional safety plan? So this section I would do when I'm doing a functional safety audit once every 3 years for the plant as a whole, but I generally would not include these questions when I am doing a functional safety assessment on a specific project. Yes, I see there's a question.
Yeah, obviously each project is different, but in your experience, how much time does it generally take to conduct, document, and report the FSAs associated with a well-executed project?
It depends on the size of the project, unfortunately. Because when let me go back to the first item. So if I go back to the first item and say, does the PHA identify the hazards protected by the SIS? Well, how do I know that? Me as an assessor, I need to have gut feel experience on the unit that I'm looking at and the pieces of equipment that I'm looking at. So if I'm doing functional safety assessment on a hydrocracker, but the PHA has no discussion of the anti-backflow shutdown that prevents backflow of the reactor circuit into the feed system if the feed pump stops, that's a problem. So the scope of the project is going to amplify how much work that is. So if I'm doing a project that's one safety function, that's simple. That took me like a minute. But if I'm doing a project on a hydrocracker complex, well, there's reactor systems, there's feed pump systems, there's several heater systems, there's a recycle compressor system, there is a recycle compressor system. So the answer that you don't want is it depends. But then let me kind of backstop it a little bit. If we're talking about an MOC project with one or two safety functions, a stage 3 FSA should be done with a couple people in maybe an hour. So basically that's that hour of team time, maybe an hour to review the documents and generate the report. If we're talking about a medium-sized SIS project, let's say 20, 30 safety instrumented functions, stage 3, which means I'm going to do stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, is probably going to take, let's say, about a day of base load time, maybe a couple days of team time and review time. So maybe 3 days of effort there. If we're talking about a massive couple hundred safety instrumented functions, we could be talking a week, week and a half for the level of effort for that FSA. So again, the more safety functions you have, the more time each one of these bullet items takes to perform the review. Could be anywhere from an hour from one safety function to a couple weeks for a large multi-unit complex.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So I mentioned here, like when you hit the audit phase, this worksheet number 6, yeah, absolutely. Do it for that 3-year process safety management audit for a specific individual project. I would toss section number 6. Okay, further customization. So from what you see here, we've got 44 questions for stage 1, 33 questions for stage 2, 21 questions for stage 3, 26 for 4, 9 for 5. Each one of those questions is going to require interviews, evidence gathering, and so on. Now, you should not be surprised that what you're looking at here is the gold standard. This, because I'm a third-party consultant, it is legally and financially irresponsible of me to half-ass stuff. So when you ask me to do something, it's going to be thorough and it's going to be good. What you're seeing here is probably a step or a couple dozen steps more than you will see for a typical operating company. So there is definitely opportunity to say, hey, Ed, I love your template as a starting point, but for my company, I need to simplify it down. And I fully understand and I fully support that you do that. I've given you the starting point with everything. You might decide, okay, this, the severity, the causes, I don't need a separate question for all of those. I'm going to combine all of that into one question, document it one time, and that's going to streamline my process. I don't begrudge you that. I absolutely support you in doing that. Feel free to go ahead and do that. If you want to talk about it, hey, send me an email. I'm, as everybody knows, I'm more than happy to answer questions via email, even occasionally set up a Teams meeting to go over some stuff if you wanted to go into that level of detail. So I see there's another question.
Yep. Do you first review the evidence or documents provided by the project team and try to answer the questions yourself before interviewing people?
No. Now that is a style choice, not a requirement from the standard. That's just the way I like to do things. I want to go, when I'm doing my Q&A, I don't already want to know what the answers are. So I want to ask questions like I don't know anything because I don't know anything. And that gives me a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more creativity, but I'm more of a flexible, creative, gregarious talking person, even though every personality profile will show that I'm clearly an introvert. I have been able to get over it. So that's why I kind of go in with a blank sheet of paper, ask a bunch of questions, kind of get a feel for how things are, and then I'll go back and review the documentation after I've gone through the interview. Now, the downside of that approach is sometimes I need to make some phone calls, send some emails to do some follow-up if my review of the documentation causes me to reconsider what we talked about during the interviews. But I like to go in cold. That's me. That's my style choice. After you do this a couple times, maybe you'll pre-plan it, maybe you'll wing it, and look at the pros and cons and figure out what works for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so with that, I've kind of set this all up, so let me take everything and kind of put a bow on it, wrap it together before we call it a day for this webinar. So functional safety auditing is a key aspect of making sure human failure doesn't cause safety instrumented systems to not respond on demand. And human failures we're going to address through administrative controls, policies, procedures, competency checks, training, and then assessment and auditing. And assessment is something that is going to occur on a project by project basis, whereas an audit is something that you're going to do in the US if you're under OSHA PSM once every 3 years as part of the overall process safety management plan. And the scope of that is going to be a snapshot in time of everything that's going on at the plant instead of one particular project. The functional safety assessment needs to be done by somebody senior, somebody competent, and somebody that's independent of the work. We want a hands-off, cold eye review of the work activities that occurred. We need to plan what stages we're doing for the functional safety assessment. There are 5 of them. A lot of times for medium projects, you wait until stage 3, right before you're ready to put oil in, before you're ready to introduce hazards to the process, before you do the functional safety assessment. But on larger projects, you might want to assess every step of the way so you don't carry an error for 6 months and have to go back and redo everything. The process for doing that FSA needs to be documented, so you have a functional safety management plan document that says who's going to do it, when they're going to do it, how they're going to do it. And for that how they're going to do it, we recommend that you simply follow the question and answer protocol using a tool like Kenexis Open-Audit. And again, if you want the enterprise version, there's a modest cost to it. I think it's $1,500 a year per a seat. Any company can easily get away with 1 seat if you want to use the corporate. But the desktop version of the software is free. And we have a template for functional safety auditing and assessment that has the questions, the tie back to where in the standard that question came from, guidance on what you should be asking the audit team, what evidence you should be collecting to make sure that you do it well. And then it's just a matter of implementing the project. When you get done, you hit the old print button, and it's going to export all of our worksheets into Excel and allow you to generate a functional safety assessment report. So with that, actually, we do have premium tools for the report generator. I'm not going to monkey around with that. I believe we have the ability for you to use the report generator to upload a custom report template and have all of your boilerplate when you generate the report. So the premium tool, $1,500 a year for a organization, not for an individual person. 1 license is going to be suitable for an organization. It's going to give you access to this more premium report generator. But then after that, you generate your report, which is going to have recommendations. Put them into your recommendation engine to make sure that they are complied with and followed up with before you start your plant. And if your plant is already started, use that as soon as reasonably practicable rule for when you clear out those recommendations. So with that, that is functional safety assessment, overview of what it is, what you need to do. I introduced the Kenexis Open-Audit tool, which has a free version, which is a really great way to do this. Today, the only way you're going to get access to that template is to send me or Chris an email, and we will go ahead and email that document to it. You'll be able to open it with your desktop version or the premium version if that's what you're using. So with that, that's all I've got for today's discussion. Any last questions for anyone before I turn you loose to attack the rest of your day? So www.kenexis.com, you go to software, and if you click this, it's going to show you kind of a view of all of the software. Here we have validation and auditing software is Open-Audit. Here you click on trial request pricing information, or you just scroll down to the bottom and you click here and fill out this form, prove you're not a robot, and it will take you to a page where you are able to download the software. Thank you for your time.